Hey guys, tonight we begin far away from crowns and castles. In a time before names mattered and history wasn't written. This is the kind of story you listen to while the room is quiet, your phone face down, and your thoughts slowly drifting. So take a breath, let your shoulders drop, and let's move gently backward through time. We're not starting with an empire, or a dynasty, or a dramatic betrayal between cousins who really shouldn't have married. We're starting before civilization, before farming, before anyone decided land ownership was worth arguing about. For most of human history, none of that existed, and honestly, nobody seemed in a hurry. Modern humans have been around for roughly 300,000 years, depending on which fossil you're asking politely. But for at least 100,000 of those years, life looked very different from anything we'd recognize today. No cities, no writing, no laws, and absolutely no meetings that could have been emails. People lived in small groups, usually extended families, wandering slowly through landscapes that felt endless. They followed animals, seasons, and water, carrying only what could be moved, without too much complaining. If something broke, you fixed it, reused it, or shrugged and made another one. There was no concept of falling behind in life because there was no schedule to fall behind on, no age milestones, no career ladders, no social pressure to accomplish something impressive by 30. Survival was the only resume that mattered, and even that was taken one day at a time. Time didn't feel like a resource that was running out, because nobody was measuring it. Days were marked by light and dark, warmth and cold, hunger and rest. The idea of counting years would have sounded unnecessarily stressful. Children learned by watching, copying, and occasionally getting things wrong in mildly dangerous ways. Adults didn't specialize much, because everyone needed to know a little bit of everything. You hunted when you could, gathered when it made sense, and rested when your body insisted. And bodies, back then, were doing a lot of quiet work just to keep things functioning. Life expectancy was shorter, but not because everyone dropped dead at 20. It was more uneven, with long calm stretches interrupted by sudden bad luck. Illness wasn't understood, but it was observed, accepted, and endured without much philosophical debate. There were no theories about germs, but there was a deep awareness of pain, healing, and limits. People noticed patterns, even if they didn't write them down. Death, too, was familiar without being theatrical. It happened nearby, often, and without ceremony that we'd recognize as formal. Grief existed, of course, but it didn't pause the rhythm of daily survival for long. There were no kings to blame, no gods officially endorsed by the state. Spirits, stories, and beliefs likely shifted from group to group, flexible and personal. Faith was probably quiet, practical, and closely tied to weather and animals. And animals were everywhere, not symbols or metaphors, but neighbors and competitors. Some were hunted, some were feared, some were quietly respected from a distance. None of them were pets yet, although that idea was slowly warming up in the background. Fire was the closest thing to a miracle anyone had. It kept people warm, scared predators away, and made food easier to eat. Sitting near it at night probably felt like the safest place in the world. As generations passed, Nothing dramatic seemed to change, and that was the point. Stability wasn't achieved through progress, but through repetition. Doing what worked yesterday was usually enough. And somewhere deep inside this long, quiet stretch of time, something subtle was happening. Brains were growing, social bonds were tightening, and stories were becoming more detailed. No one noticed it in real time because change was measured in millennia. We'll drift slowly forward from here, not rushing, not announcing turning points with fanfare. Because history didn't suddenly wake up one morning and decide to begin. It just kept going, like this, until one small idea changed everything. As humans kept moving through landscapes that hadn't been named yet, their days settled into familiar patterns. Walking, watching, listening, and waiting took up more time than anything else. Thinking happened quietly in the background, like a slow-burning fire. Most mornings began without urgency, because urgency wastes energy. People woke when the light arrived, not when something beeped or rang. If the weather was bad, plans simply adjusted themselves. Food was never guaranteed, but it wasn't constantly panicked over either. Experience taught where animals passed, where plants returned each season. Memory mattered more than ambition, and patience mattered more than strength. Tools were simple, but they weren't careless. A stone hand axe might look crude now, but it was shaped with intention. Someone spent time on that edge, thinking slowly, correcting mistakes. Nothing was mass-produced, because nothing needed to be. Each object had a short, practical life, then quietly disappeared back into the ground. Archaeologists would later find them and get very excited about rocks. Clothing was functional and probably itchy most of the time. Animal skins were scraped, stretched, and tied together with plant fibers or sinew. Fashion trends did not exist, and nobody missed them. Shelter changed with the seasons rather than fighting against them. Sometimes it was a cave, sometimes branches and hides arranged just well enough. Staying flexible mattered more than building something permanent. There was no sense of owning land in the modern way. Territory was understood, respected, and shared through memory and negotiation. Crossing the wrong path could cause tension, but not paperwork. Social life stayed small, intimate, and unavoidable. You couldn't ghost someone when your group was 20 people total. If someone annoyed you, you still had to walk beside them tomorrow. Leadership existed, but it wasn't crowned or inherited. It shifted depending on age, experience, and who knew what at the moment. The best hunter didn't automatically become the boss of everything. Older members carried something more valuable than strength. They carried stories, roots, mistakes, and warnings earned the hard way. Listening to them was usually safer than ignoring them. Children were never far from the adult world. They watched everything, absorbed routines, and joined in as soon as they could. Learning was constant, informal, and sometimes a little dangerous. Play and work weren't clearly separated ideas. Throwing stones could be practice or entertainment, depending on the mood. No one argued about productivity metrics. As humans spread into colder regions, adaptation became quietly impressive. Clothing improved, shelters thickened, and fire management got smarter. Complaining about winter didn't help, so people adjusted instead. cooking slowly transformed bodies and brains over thousands of years. Softer food meant less chewing and more energy for thinking. Evolution loves efficiency, especially the boring kind. Language grew richer without anyone announcing its upgrade. Sounds became words. Words became shared meanings. Gossip probably arrived very early and never left. Stories were told without writing, but not without structure. Repeated rhythms helped memory, and familiar phrases made stories stick. Myths were flexible, shifting slightly with each retelling. These stories weren't entertainment in the modern sense. They explained animals, seasons, danger, and death in manageable pieces. They made the world feel less random. Spiritual ideas existed without temples or hierarchies. Belief lived in landscapes, animals, and small rituals. No one argued about doctrine because no one had written it down. Burials began appearing more deliberately over time. Bodies were placed with care, sometimes with objects or pigments. It suggested memory, respect, and maybe something beyond survival. This wasn't a sudden awakening, just a gradual deepening. Humans became more aware of themselves and each other. Self-reflection arrived quietly, without applause, for tens of thousands of years. This pace continued. Groups moved, split, reunited, and disappeared without records. Most lives passed without ever being known beyond a few faces, and yet, nothing about this period was stagnant. Change was happening, just not in ways that looked impressive later. Small improvements mattered more than big revolutions. The idea of settling down permanently still hadn't arrived. Why would it, when mobility kept people alive? Staying in one place felt risky, not comforting. Animals were followed, not controlled. Plants were gathered, not grown on purpose. Nature set the schedule, and humans followed politely. Somewhere in this long stretch, dogs quietly joined the story, not as pets, but as tolerated companions who slowly earned trust. It was cooperation without a contract. Even conflict existed in muted forms. Arguments happened, tensions rose. But large-scale warfare was rare. There was little to gain and too much to lose. Without stored wealth, jealousy stayed limited. You couldn't hoard much when everything had to be carried. Inequality hadn't found its footing yet. Health varied wildly depending on luck and environment. Injuries healed slowly. Infections were unpredictable. But bodies were strong, used to constant movement. Life expectancy statistics don't tell the whole story here. Some died young, others lived surprisingly long. Survival favored awareness more than youth. As the climate shifted, again and again, humans adapted patiently. Ice retreated, deserts expanded, forests changed shape. Groups moved with these changes, not against them. And then, very gradually, something new began to form. Not a city, not a kingdom, not even a village yet. Just a slightly longer pause in familiar places. People started returning to the same spots more often. Certain valleys, riverbanks, and plains felt reliable. The idea of home began to thicken. No one called it a revolution. No one knew they were standing at the edge of something massive. It felt like another small adjustment, nothing more. But this pause, this lingering, would eventually change everything. Not quickly, Not cleanly, and definitely not peacefully, just slowly enough that no one could stop it. Wheel, drift toward that moment next, still calm, still unhurried, still unaware of what's coming. Because history never warns you when it's about to speed up. Those familiar places kept pulling people back, season after season, without any official decision being made. A river that never fully dried, a valley where animals returned, a hillside with edible plants. Memory slowly anchored movement, turning wandering paths into repeated loops. At first, these pauses were temporary and cautious. No one trusted a single location enough to stay forever. Staying flexible still felt safer than committing. People would linger for weeks, sometimes months, then move on again. But each return felt easier, more familiar, less uncertain. The land itself started to feel predictable. With predictability came small experiments. Seeds dropped accidentally were noticed when they grew again. Someone probably said nothing, just quietly remembered the spot. Gathering plants became more observant, less random. Certain routes were taken carefully, others left alone. It wasn't farming yet, just attention. Animals were still followed, but routes were memorized more precisely. Humans learned when herds passed through and where they paused. Hunting became about timing as much as skill. More time in one place meant more stuff lying around. Tools didn't always need to be carried anymore. Leaving things behind started to feel normal. That small shift mattered more than anyone realized. Objects began to accumulate instead of disappearing. Possessions, very quietly, were being invented. Shelters grew a little sturdier. Why not add another branch, another hide, if you'll be back soon? Temporary structures began pretending to be permanent. Fire pits were reused instead of rebuilt. Ash layers stacked up, marking time without intention. The ground itself kept records before humans did. Social groups grew slightly larger in these reliable areas. Different families overlapped more often. Familiar strangers became part of the landscape. With more people came more opinions. Small disagreements took longer to dissolve. Avoiding someone wasn't as easy when movement slowed. Leadership roles became stickier. The person who organized food or managed disputes kept doing it. Experience began to turn into authority. Not formal power, not yet. Just habits that people relied on. Reliance is a quiet foundation for hierarchy. Children grew up seeing the same faces year after year. They learned places, not just paths. Their world felt smaller, but more stable. Stories changed slightly too. They became tied to locations instead of journeys. This happened here started to mean something. Burials grew more intentional in these places. The dead were placed where the living returned. Memory attached itself to soil. This attachment brought comfort and tension at the same time. Belonging felt good. Sharing space felt complicated. Resources that once felt endless now had limits. Overuse became noticeable. Someone taking too much mattered more than before. Rules emerged without being written. Who gathers where? Who hunts when? Custom became law without calling itself that. Bodies adapted to this slower rhythm. Less constant walking, more repetitive motions. Joints noticed the change. Diet shifted subtly as well. More plants, fewer unpredictable hunts. Nutrition became steadier, but narrower. Teeth began showing new patterns of wear. Softer foods, more grinding. Biology keeps receipts. Time felt different in these semi-settled lives. Days still followed light and dark, but seasons mattered more than journeys. People waited instead of moved. They anticipated growth and return. Waiting requires patience and trust. Trust in the land. Trust in each other. Trust that staying put wouldn't backfire. Of course, sometimes it did. Droughts, floods, or sudden cold spells hit harder. Mobility had been a safety net. When conditions worsened, staying felt risky. Leaving felt harder than it used to. Attachment has a cost. Some groups returned to full wandering. Others pushed through difficulties and stayed anyway. There was no single path forward. Innovation crept in through necessity. Storage pits appeared to save food for later. Saving for the future became possible. That idea alone changed human thinking. Planning extended beyond the next few days. Tomorrow started to matter more. With stored food came protection. Someone had to watch it. Someone had to decide who accessed it. Inequality didn't arrive dramatically. It tiptoed in through responsibility and control. Not everyone liked that. Conflict increased, but not in epic ways. Arguments over access, boundaries, and effort. Small tensions layered slowly. Tools diversified as tasks specialized. Some people got better at grinding grain. Others focused on hunting or building. Specialization brought efficiency and dependence. You needed others more than before. Independence quietly faded. Art began appearing more often in these places. Carvings, pigments, patterns repeated over time. Expression had room to linger. These weren't masterpieces meant to impress. They were familiar marks in familiar spaces, comforting more than expressive. Rituals deepened as repetition increased. Seasonal gatherings marked changes in food and weather. Time gained shared meaning. Nobody called this civilization. Nobody thought they were inventing the future. They were just adapting again. But the balance was shifting. Movement was no longer the default solution. Staying had momentum now. Generations grew up knowing fewer landscapes. Their world shrank geographically. It grew socially instead. Knowledge became localized. You knew this valley deeply. Other places faded into rumor. Trade began quietly between nearby groups, exchanging stone, shells, or tools. Contact widened without travel. Ideas moved faster than people. Techniques spread by observation and imitation. Innovation didn't need borders. At the same time, isolation hardened identities. US and them felt clearer. Difference became noticeable. Language reflected this change. Dialects formed. Words anchored to place. The land was no longer just passed through. It was remembered, named, and defended. Ownership was forming without paperwork. All of this happened without a single dramatic moment. No announcement, no turning point, just slow accumulation. And yet, looking back, this was everything. The pause before agriculture. The inhale before the long exhale of civilization. Next, we'll drift into the moment when humans fully committed. When plants were no longer gathered, but controlled. When staying stopped being optional. Still gently, still slowly. Because once this starts, it doesn't stop. At some point, watching plants grow stopped being passive and became intentional. Seeds were no longer just noticed. they were placed. Hands pressed them into soil with expectation. This wasn't a sudden decision made in a meeting no one recorded. It happened unevenly, hesitantly, and probably with a lot of second-guessing. Because trusting plants is a long-term commitment. Early cultivation was messy and unreliable. Crops failed, weather ignored plans, and pests arrived uninvited. Nature didn't care that humans were trying something new. Still, the idea stuck. If plants could be encouraged to grow nearby, movement became less necessary. Less movement meant more control, at least in theory. Fields weren't neat rows yet. They were patches of managed chaos. Weeds and crops argued constantly. Farming demanded patience in a way hunting never had. You couldn't rush a seed by wanting it harder. Waiting became part of daily life. With farming came calendars, even if they weren't written down. People tracked seasons more carefully than ever. Missing the right moment mattered now. The land changed under this pressure. Forests thinned, grasses spread, soil was disturbed repeatedly. Human fingerprints stayed visible longer. Living near fields meant staying put through good seasons and bad. Mobility, once a solution, now felt like failure. Abandoning crops meant abandoning effort. Food supplies became more predictable, but less diverse. Grains filled bellies reliably. Nutrition quietly narrowed again. Bodies responded in noticeable ways. People grew shorter. Bones showed stress. Teeth suffered. Progress rarely checks in with health first. Workdays lengthened without anyone calling it that. Fields didn't care if you were tired. Plants waited, silently demanding attention. Children became part of the labor earlier. Small hands pulled weeds, carried water, scared birds. Play learned to coexist with responsibility. With surplus food came population growth. More mouths survived, more babies were born. Crowding became normal. Villages grew tighter, noisier, more complex. Privacy vanished quickly. Everyone knew everyone's habits. Storage mattered more than ever. Granaries appeared, guarded carefully. Food stopped being communal by default. Someone always controlled access. At first, it was practical. Later, it became political. Social differences sharpened. Some families accumulated more grain, more tools, more influence. Equality quietly stepped aside. Leadership hardened into roles instead of moments. Decisions stuck to certain people. Authority learned how to sit comfortably. Conflict shifted from movement to boundaries. Fields needed protection. Neighbors needed watching. Walls appeared, not always for enemies, sometimes for livestock. Separation felt safer. Division became visible. Animals entered a new relationship with humans. Some were penned, bred, and controlled. Domestication worked both ways. Life rhythms changed around planting and harvest. Time became cyclical and demanding. Rest had to be scheduled. Rituals grew more elaborate around crops. Success felt dependent on forces beyond control. Belief systems thickened. Gods became interested in rain, fertility, and yield. Offerings replaced observation. Hope became structured. Disease spread more easily in settled life. Crowding helped pathogens travel. Illness became a regular companion. Waste accumulated where movement once cleared it. Sanitation lagged behind settlement. Smell was part of the environment. Despite all this, people stayed. The investment was too deep to abandon easily. Roots held stronger than doubt. Villages connected into networks. Trade routes expanded. Ideas and goods moved together. Craft specialization intensified. Potters, toolmakers, builders emerged. Skill became identity. Writing still hadn't arrived, but memory systems grew complex. Markers, symbols, and tallies tracked ownership. Accounting came before literature. Generations born into farming never experienced wandering life. Movement became story instead of habit. The past felt distant. Children learned boundaries before landscapes. Their world had edges now. Freedom felt different. As villages grew, some locations dominated others. Access to water, fertile land, or trade paths mattered. Power clustered geographically. The first proto-cities formed without ceremony. Just bigger villages with more problems and more opportunities. Inequality stopped pretending to be accidental. It became inherited. Families passed down advantage. Conflict scaled up with population density. Disputes involved groups instead of individuals. Resolution required structure. That structure would soon demand records. Memory alone couldn't keep up anymore. Writing waited just ahead. But before kings and crowns, there was something else. Administration. The quiet machinery of control. Will drift their necks into the spaces where organization replaced flexibility, and where history finally decided to start writing itself. Once power settled into families, it stopped being just practical and became personal. Ruling wasn't a task you did. It was something you were, and that kind of identity comes with pressure. Early elites lived surrounded by people, yet rarely felt alone. Advisors whispered, servants watched, rivals waited. Privacy became a memory. Every decision carried weight beyond the moment. A bad harvest wasn't just unfortunate. It was political. Blame had a direction now. Rulers were expected to appear certain. Even when they weren't, doubt was allowed privately, if at all. Confidence became part of the costume. Sleep likely came. In fragments, worries lingered, plans replayed, threats imagined. Power does not rest easily. Succession anxiety hovered constantly. Children were not just loved. They were evaluated. Health, temperament, obedience all mattered. Illness in an heir caused quiet panic. A weak child threatened stability. Empires worried about fevers. Marriages were arranged early and carefully. Love was optional. Alliances were not. Personal happiness ranked low. Spouses became political tools first. Companions second. Affection sometimes followed. Sometimes it didn't. Women in elite families carried unique pressure. Their bodies became diplomatic assets. Fertility was monitored closely. Miscarriages were mourned privately, but counted publicly. Failure was framed as fate. Responsibilities still landed heavily. Rulers learned to distrust easily. Compliments could hide ambition. Silence could hide plotting. Friendships were complicated by status. Equality was rare at the top. Loneliness disguised itself as authority. Public appearances mattered more than comfort. Ceremonies were exhausting performances. Image required maintenance. Even leisure was structured. Hunts, feasts, rituals all served purpose. Relaxation was never neutral. Elites aged under constant observation. Wrinkles became symbols of wisdom or weakness. Time was unkind to rulers. Mistakes echoed loudly. A poor decision could destabilize generations. Regret had long shadows. Children raised in power learned restraint early. Emotion was something to manage. Expression carried risk. Education focused on control, history, and obedience. Curiosity existed within limits. Freedom was carefully rationed. Religion offered comfort, but also obligation. Rulers were watched by gods as well as people. Failure felt cosmic. Some elites turned inward. Rituals, superstition, and control rituals multiplied. Certainty was soothing. Others turned outward. Expansion distracted from instability. New territory postponed old problems. But expansion created new pressures. Borders stretched. Enemies multiplied. Success demanded repetition. Power amplified personality traits. Calm rulers stayed calm. Anxious rulers became unbearable. Mental health struggles existed without language. Melancholy, paranoia, obsession went unnamed. Behavior was explained away. Violence sometimes appeared as release. Not constant, not dramatic, just another tool. Despite this, elites believed in their role deeply. Order depended on them, or so they were told. Common people saw power from below, distant, ritualized, intimidating. Humanity blurred by ceremony. The gap between ruler and rule felt natural now. Inevitability replaced curiosity. Hierarchy settled in. And yet, beneath the symbols and silence, rulers were still human. They worried about legacy, memory, and survival. The same fears, just magnified. This emotional weight shaped decisions. Quietly, policies weren't just rational. They were personal. Next, we'll drift into how these pressures aged dynasties, how power distorted families over generations, and why ruling bloodlines rarely stayed healthy for long. Once dynasties formed, the obsession with keeping power inside families began quietly. Marriages were arranged between cousins, uncles, nieces, whatever preserved bloodlines. Genetics, at this point, was a theory no one consulted. The results were sometimes unusual. Facial features shifted in strange ways. Sometimes called handsome or beautiful politely. Other times, less politely. They looked like a half-baked family recipe gone wrong. Children were both blessings and liabilities. Health, temperament, and fertility mattered more than personality. One weak heir could unravel decades of careful planning. Families noticed patterns early. Sicknesses, deformities, and mental fragility were catalogued quietly. Stories whispered around corridors became early warning signs. Rulers tried to compensate. Regimens, diets, baths, medicinal herbs, prayers, all layered together. Control felt necessary, if imperfect. Emotional strain was inherited, as well as physical traits. Paranoia, anxiety, and melancholy lingered like family heirlooms. Even cheerful children could carry invisible burdens. The court amplified everything. Every glance, rumor, and mistake was magnified. Small weaknesses became crises. Marriage negotiations doubled down on strategy. Love was a footnote. Alliances were primary. Fertility and obedience overshadowed all else. Yet humans remained. Stubbornly human, Affection, rivalry, and curiosity poked through carefully drawn lines. Secrets and small rebellions quietly persisted. In some families, excessive inbreeding created predictable challenges. Heads were oddly shaped, chins uneven, or features mismatched. Doctors of the time called it fate. Mental fragility also became more visible. Irritability, extreme moods, and emotional collapses were tolerated, sometimes even expected. The world outside the palace couldn't understand the pressures inside. Rituals and etiquette became coping mechanisms. Long, repetitive ceremonies distracted from anxiety. Repetition gave structure to fragile lives. Heirs were watched constantly. Every cough, stumble, or misstep recorded mentally, if not literally. An accident could mean political recalibration. Some rulers became increasingly eccentric. Collections of odd objects, obsessive habits, extreme routines. Eccentricity was safe, predictable, and socially acceptable. Family dynamics were as strategic as battles. Alliances and rivalries intertwined in everyday life. Trust was precious, scarce, and expensive. Bodies and minds bore the weight of history silently. No one applauded endurance. They just expected it. Despite all fragility, life went on. Dynasties adapted in small, quiet ways. Lessons passed down through survival, not written manuals. And yet, history noticed the cracks. Small tragedies compounded over generations. Bloodlines showed evidence of human limitation. We'll drift next into the quieter tragedies of royal children, the spoiled, sickly, and emotionally fragile heirs, because childhood in dynasties was rarely carefree. In dynasties, children weren't just children. They were investments, trophies, and potential disasters rolled into one. Every cough, every tantrum, every stumble was a report card. Nurseries were more like observation rooms, where nurses, tutors, and attendants kept constant watch. Parents rarely saw them without layers of ritual. Play existed, but it was monitored and controlled. Games taught obedience, skill, or stamina. Fun was educational, never spontaneous. Health was scrutinized obsessively. Sickness could ruin succession plans. Even minor fevers caused quiet panic. Diet was prescribed and calculated. Rich foods for growth, careful portions for strength. Herbs and tonics appeared as standard maintenance. Education began early. Letters, numbers, languages, and protocol consumed most days. Mistakes were not punished harshly, but noted. Personality was trained as much as intelligence. Temperament mattered for diplomacy and leadership. Cheerfulness was tolerated only when convenient. Social interaction was strategic. Playmates were chosen for alliances, not friendship. Rivalries were subtly encouraged. Children observed adults endlessly. They learned posture, speech, and caution. Imitation was survival. Quirks were magnified. A child who refused food might be remembered as weak. One who laughed too loudly could be called unruly. Some children suffered quietly. Fragile health, emotional sensitivity, and inherited traits all combined. Palaces became prisons of expectation. Misbehavior had consequences. Isolation, ridicule, or pressure to conform were standard tools. Authority overshadowed childhood. Education blended with duty. Lessons in hunting, combat, or diplomacy happened side by side. Every action served preparation. Children were taught to internalize stress. Anxiety and melancholy became invisible companions. Expression had limits, yet curiosity persisted in small, quiet ways. Secret explorations, hidden observations, whispered experiments. The mind found ways to escape. Sibling relationships were complex. Competition for favor and survival intertwined with genuine attachment. Love and rivalry coexisted uneasily. Childhood illnesses could shape history. A sickly heir might be bypassed. A premature death could shift alliances entirely. Emotional fragility wasn't always punished directly. It was watched, catalogued, and sometimes exploited. The stakes were invisible but immense. Play, ritual, and learning blurred together. Even leisure carried the weight of observation. Nothing was free from consequence. And yet, children grew into adults shaped by necessity, expectation, and survival. Some thrived, some struggled, some simply endured. The rhythm of dynasty was evident even in youth. Life was controlled, slow, and deliberate. Every generation repeated lessons learned painfully. Next, we'll drift toward the strange habits, eccentricities, and quiet obsessions of these adult rulers. Because surviving childhood was only the beginning, life in power introduced new pressures, oddities, and long shadows. Once childhood ended, surviving didn't mean thriving. Adulthood in a dynasty introduced a new set of pressures, and the public and private self rarely matched. Rulers developed routines that looked strange to outsiders. Repetitive inspections, strict schedules, and compulsive habits became normal because control, after years of training, felt necessary. Some rulers obsessed over cleanliness baths multiple times a day. Clothes changed obsessively, hands scrubbed endlessly where illness, or even the idea of it, could dominate attention. Others hoarded objects, jewels, documents, tools, or curiosities piled quietly around living spaces, with possessions becoming symbols of stability. Eating habits were similarly ritualized, meals measured, timed, and sometimes symbolic, where food became control as much as sustenance. Sleep was structured, not restful. Naps, watches, and guarded hours replaced natural rhythm. And dreams were likely brief and monitored internally. Some rulers developed strange phobias animals, sounds, weather patterns. Nothing was exempt. As fear and survival instincts merged with authority, hobbies were intense and focused. Hunting, collecting, or scholarly pursuits absorbed attention fully, and leisure was simply work refrained. Correspondence consumed attention as letters, reports, and petitions required careful reading, because ignoring them was dangerous. Trust was rare, even advisors were suspect, and paranoia, when mild, was protective. Public appearances contrasted sharply with private quirks. A calm, collected exterior hid nervous repetition, and the persona became a mask. Clothing, jewelry, and posture reinforced hierarchy. Symbols communicated authority silently, and every detail mattered. Rituals of the court extended beyond religion. Daily ceremonies, seating arrangements, and feasts reinforced control, and everyone performed their place. Mental strain compounded across years. Decisions were constant, stakes were high, mistakes amplified, and fatigue became a constant companion. Yet rulers often survived through eccentricity. Odd habits became tolerated, expected, and sometimes admired, as eccentricity disguised pressure. These habits could influence governance subtly, with obsessions determining resource allocation, priorities and alliances, and personality shaping policy. Dynastic pressures magnified emotional tendencies, where melancholy, obsession, or irritability often defined reigns. And history remembered quirks more than logic. Every small decision carried legacy weight. A choice about marriage, construction, or ritual could ripple for generations. And even minor indulgences became significant. And so rulers lived in tension, private anxiety, public performance. Inherited expectation, life structured, repetitive, and heavy. Next, we'll drift into how dynastic patterns created tragic, fragile lines over generations. Because the repetition of expectation often had hidden costs, and the longer a family stayed on top, the stranger and more delicate it became. Over generations, dynasties accumulated more than wealth, they accumulated fragility. Inbreeding, stress, and expectation combined quietly, producing unusual outcomes. Bodies and minds absorbed history in subtle, persistent ways. Facial features shifted, sometimes dramatically, across generations. Some children were called handsome politely, others less politely, as genetics compounded. Odd proportions, physical weaknesses, and visible strain became common. Mental health reflected the same pressures. Paranoia, melancholy, and mood swings intensified silently over time. These traits were both inherited and amplified by upbringing. Marriage strategies doubled down on safety. Cousins, uncles, nieces, any arrangement that kept bloodlines pure. Love, affection, and compatibility took a distant second place. Children bore invisible burdens from birth. Expectation, observation, and survival shaped early development. Even play became a subtle test of character. Small illnesses could derail succession. A fever, a cough, or a minor deformity shifted power quietly. History pivoted on tiny misfortunes. Siblings competed carefully and subtly. Favor, opportunity, and survival intertwined. Rivalry was constant, but polite. Parents monitored children constantly. Every movement, word, and habit recorded mentally. Behavior became a report card. Nutrition, activity, and education were meticulously controlled. Every choice weighed against legacy. Every misstep became an inherited lesson. Adults in power rarely escaped these pressures. Childhood stress evolved into obsession, eccentricity, and emotional fragility. Even the strongest rulers carried invisible weight. Physical weakness was tolerated only if compensated by cunning. Appearance, posture, and habit mattered more than comfort. All of life became performance. Dynasties grew accustomed to repetition. Habits, rituals, and rules compounded with each generation. Innovation existed mostly in surviving expectation. Tragic patterns emerged, short lifespans, fragile heirs, and mental strain marked some lines. Long-lived dynasties became a careful balancing act. Public and private life diverged. The court witnessed power and stability. Private chambers hid worry, eccentricity, and fragility. Health, temperament, and fertility dictated political stability. Small personal failures could cascade into large social consequences. The stakes were invisible but immense. Stories of unusual rulers, eccentric habits, and fragile heirs multiplied. History recorded them selectively. Curiosity, melancholy, and obsession defined their lives as much as policy. And yet, dynasties persisted. Expectation became rhythm. Routine became armor. This pattern repeated for centuries. Power concentrated, fragility intensified, and survival became a skill. Every generation inherited the weight of the previous. Next, we'll drift into the quiet, often overlooked daily lives of these rulers. The routines, habits, and endless small pressures that shaped history slowly, persistently, and invisibly. Daily life for rulers was less about spectacle and more about repetition. Every day followed rituals, schedules, and endless observation. The public saw ceremony, the private self-managed tension. Mornings began with inspection, reading, and review. Reports arrived in heaps, each carrying potential problems. Even small mistakes could ripple outward. Meals were measured and timed. Food was fuel, ritual, and status symbol simultaneously. Deviation from schedule was noted, silently or not. Sleep was monitored or interrupted. Short naps, unusual hours, and constant readiness replaced natural rhythms. Dreams were likely brief and disciplined. Children, if present, were observed constantly. Play, education, and chores blended together. Nothing went unseen. Rulers often engaged in hobbies or obsessions. Hunting, collecting, religious rituals, or scholarship absorbed attention. Even leisure had a purpose. Advisors, servants, and families surrounded them. Every glance, whisper, or hesitation mattered. Trust was always calculated. Public appearances contrasted sharply with private quirks. A calm, composed exterior hid nervous repetition or odd habits. Control remained constant. Decisions were never truly final. Even small choices about meals, construction, or seating could escalate. Every action carried consequence. Illness, minor injury, or fatigue were managed meticulously. Weakness could threaten perception and authority. Even the healthy worried about the next problem. Interaction with peers and rivals required strategy. Friendship, alliance, and rivalry blended seamlessly. No conversation was neutral. Leisure became performance in subtle ways. Games, hunts, or music reinforced skill, stamina, and attention. Relaxation was carefully structured. The emotional weight was invisible but persistent. Anxiety, melancholy, or obsession shaped behavior over years. Even small successes carried pressure for the next day. Ritual and habit provided relief and structure. Repetition became protective. Predictability replaced uncertainty. Education continued, even for adults. Reading, language, history, and ritual required constant attention. Survival was intellectual as much as physical. Family dynamics remained strategic. Marriage, inheritance, and succession demanded continuous planning. Children inherited expectation as much as resources. Even the environment influenced behavior. Light, noise, temperature, and season guided routines. Every element of life was noticed and adapted to. Mental strain persisted through decades. The body followed, absorbing stress silently. Eccentricity often disguised anxiety. And yet, Despite all pressures, life continued in quiet rhythm. Ritual, routine, and repetition formed the backbone of survival. Power demanded calm performance, even under strain. Next, we'll drift toward the subtle influence of these rulers on broader society. How their habits, obsessions, and routines shaped not just palaces, but the lives of everyone around them. Every ruler's preference quietly affected everyone nearby. What they ate, how they dressed, the schedules they enforced or rippled outward. Courtiers, servants, and neighbors adjusted without realizing it. Feasts and rituals dictated timing for work and rest. Farmers aligned planting and harvest around ceremonial calendars. Even minor schedule changes could create ripple effects in society. Hunting practices influenced local animal populations. Preferred game was protected, other species ignored. Ecosystems adapted slowly to human habits. Architecture reflected ruler obsession. Walls, gates, corridors, and private chambers dictated movement. Cities and palaces grew around habits and rituals. Clothing styles spread from the elite downward. Silks, dyes, and decorations became symbols of rank. Commoners adapted, or ignored them selectively. Trade routes shifted based on palace demand. Exotic goods moved first toward elite consumption. Economy adjusted quietly to the whims of a few. Labor routines reflected elite obsession. Builders, artisans, and servants coordinated tasks precisely. Every action supported someone's expectation of order. Ritual and religion amplified authority. Priests, ceremonies, and offerings reinforced both spiritual and political control. Belief systems codified elite priorities. Health and diet influenced population habits. Preferred foods set standards for nutrition and preparation. Herbs, medicines, and brewing practices trickled downward. Education mirrored elite patterns. Literacy, counting, and administration spread gradually. Schools reflected what rulers valued. Even leisure habits mattered. Music, games, and performance is filtered through social hierarchy. Commoners absorbed culture carefully. Emotional tone from the palace influenced mood broadly. Anxious or irritable rulers created tense environments. Calm and measured leaders inspired steadiness. Legal and administrative habits structured daily life. Rules, fines, and expectations codified behavior quietly. Authority reached beyond the palace walls. Generations internalized these rhythms. Children learned to live within inherited structures. Daily life mirrored elite expectation without conscious choice. Power moves slowly outward, like heat from a fire. Influence spread even without formal command. Custom, habit, and example became invisible governance. And yet, these pressures were invisible to most. Life continued, rhythmically, quietly, like a river shaped by unseen banks. Small, persistent influence quietly molded entire societies. Next, we'll drift into how dynasties aged, declined, and occasionally collapsed under the weight of their own routines. Because no matter how controlled life seemed, inertia has limits. Even the most carefully managed dynasties eventually faced the limits of their systems. Generations compounded fragility, expectations, and inherited eccentricities. What once seemed sustainable became brittle over time. Children inherited habits, obsessions, and vulnerabilities. Weak heirs, short-lived rulers, or unpredictable personalities created subtle instability. Small cracks appeared quietly, unnoticed at first. Inbreeding amplified physical and mental fragility. Facial oddities, skeletal issues, and chronic ailments accumulated over generations. Doctors and advisors could mitigate, but rarely prevent these patterns. Leadership itself became a burden. The more authority a family accumulated, the more scrutiny and expectation weighed on each individual. Decisions that once felt trivial now carried enormous consequences. Routine became ritualized to the point of rigidity. Flexibility diminished. Improvisation was discouraged. When unexpected crises arose, response lagged. Economic pressures intensified slowly. Surplus had to be managed, trade maintained, and taxation enforced. Small mismanagement rippled outward into unrest. Social tension grew beneath ceremonial calm. Servants, artisans, and commoners observed inequalities silently. Pressure mounted in subtle ways. External threats compounded internal fragility. Neighboring states, raiders, or opportunistic factions noticed weakness. Even small miscalculations could be exploited. The combination of internal and external pressures created cycles of stress. Rulers became paranoid, cautious, or erratic. Decision-making slowed or skewed unpredictably. Ceremonies sometimes masked instability. Grand feasts, rituals, and displays of wealth hid fractures beneath. Spectacle preserved appearance even as function faltered. Succession crises were common. Heirs died unexpectedly, were incapable, or challenged each other. Civil tension often rose quietly, like water before a flood. Families repeated mistakes unknowingly. Pattern recognition existed, but inertia prevented change. Tradition became both armor and trap. Health crises were magnified. Even ordinary illnesses could destabilize governance. Fragile dynasties paid dearly for minor misfortune. By the time decline became visible, it was usually too late. Small failures compounded over decades. Collapse wasn't sudden, it was patient. Yet history remembers collapse through spectacle. Wars, deposition, or dramatic death are recorded. The subtle erosion, slow and pervasive, often goes unnoticed. Even in decline, routines persisted. Rituals continued, habits repeated, and expectations lingered. Old patterns died more slowly than individuals. And yet, from these declines, new structures arose. Lessons were absorbed cautiously by survivors. Dynasties reshaped, relocated, or reinvented themselves. Next, we'll drift into the quiet legacy of dynastic human behavior. How habits, obsession, and inherited expectation shaped the foundations of modern society. Even centuries later, traces remain. Even long after a dynasty faded, its influence lingered. Patterns of behavior, obsession, and control subtly shaped societies. Custom, ritual, and hierarchy survived the collapse of individual rulers. Administrative systems endured. Counting, record-keeping, and resource management spread beyond the palace. Order outlasted the personalities that created it. Legal and social norms persisted. Rules originally designed for elite convenience became community expectation. Hierarchy became ingrained. Architecture reflected dynastic influence. Walls, streets, and public spaces still followed the logic of old rulers. Even abandoned cities carried echoes of order. Religion and ritual adapted and survived. Priestly authority, seasonal ceremonies, and festival timing retained dynastic patterns. Faith maintained societal rhythm. Economic habits endured quietly. Trade networks, market expectations, and labor specialization continued. Merchants and craftsmen inherited structure from the elite. Education and literacy spread gradually. Methods devised for heirs influenced broader schooling systems. Learning became codified. Health practices, diets, and medicine also reflected elite patterns. Herbs, brewing techniques, and food customs filtered downward. Private experimentation became public standard. Even eccentric habits left traces. Attention to detail, ritualized behavior, and obsession with control influenced society. Small routines propagated slowly. Generations internalized expectation. Children learned to observe, imitate, and conform. Behavior shaped itself quietly before instruction. Conflict resolution inherited dynastic logic. Negotiation, ritualized diplomacy, and protocol originated in elite practice. Dispute management became formalized. Population density and settlement patterns were influenced. City layouts, village routines, and transport routes reflected centuries of inherited planning. The human landscape became layered with invisible legacy. Survival strategies persisted. Preparedness, anticipation, and careful observation continued to structure life. Human adaptation carried memory forward. Even storytelling preserved lessons. Fables, chronicles, and genealogies reflected cautionary tales of power and fragility. Children learned indirectly through narrative. The psychological imprint endured. Anxiety, responsibility, and obsession shaped behavior across generations. Pressure became cultural, not only familial. Dynastic patterns also influenced governance. Leadership, hierarchy, and succession logic guided emerging states. Cultural memory carried forward methods refined over centuries. And yet, these legacies were subtle, often unnoticed. Society moved forward quietly, layered with the weight of past expectation. The influence of rulers persisted even without crowns. Next, we'll drift into the human tendency to repeat patterns, reflecting on why history often mirrors itself. Because, as we'll see, the past quietly informs the present, whether we notice or not. One of the quietest lessons from dynasties is repetition. Human behavior cycles, often without conscious awareness. Habits, obsessions, and mistakes recur across generations. Power tends to reproduce itself. Authority concentrates, hierarchy stabilizes, and privilege accumulates. Even when circumstances change, patterns remain familiar. Fragility persists quietly. Physical, mental, and emotional vulnerabilities continue to shape leadership. History's lessons are subtle, not always recognized. Marriage and inheritance still influence society. Alliances, nepotism, and strategic partnerships echo centuries-old logic. Even modern structures carry traces of dynastic reasoning. Childhood shapes adulthood as it always has. Observation, expectation, and structured learning produce behavior patterns. Repetition builds resilience or fragility. Education reflects inherited priorities, skills, literacy, and etiquette continue to be valued according to cultural memory. Past emphasis on obedience and hierarchy persists. Ritual continues to structure life. Ceremony, schedule, and repetition guide behavior subtly. Humans feel rhythm without always knowing why. Economic habits mirror historical patterns. Trade networks, labor specialization, and accumulation still follow old principles. Efficiency and hierarchy often outweigh fairness. Conflict resolution retains echoes of dynastic logic. Negotiation, precedent, and structured mediation survive in subtle ways. Tradition guides behavior silently. Urban and rural landscapes reflect past priorities. Roads, boundaries, and settlement patterns often mirror ancient choices. Even geography carries the imprint of history. Cultural memory preserves emotional patterns. Stress, anxiety, and responsibility transmit subtly across generations. Expectations persist invisibly. Stories, myths, and chronicles continue to guide understanding. Cautionary tales, heroic narratives, and moral lessons encode lessons learned slowly. Children absorb these lessons almost unconsciously. Even eccentricity can propagate. Obsessive attention, ritualized habits, and personal idiosyncrasies influence peers. Behavior spreads quietly. History teaches without direct intervention. Patterns of power, fragility, and adaptation inform future generations. Cycles repeat because humans notice rhythm more than reason. Next, we'll drift into how the accumulation of memory, habit, and observation prepared humanity for civilization itself. Because before formal empires and codified law, humans had already been learning, adapting, and quietly building the foundations for everything that followed. Before formal empires or codified law, humans had already built invisible scaffolding. Observation, memory, and habit shaped daily life. Small lessons accumulated over generations, quietly preparing societies for complexity. Settlements had already taught humans about cooperation, sharing labor, managing resources, and coordinating schedules became routine. Survival required attention, planning, and subtle negotiation. Counting, record-keeping, and early administration persisted. Even without formal writing, humans tracked obligations, resources, and relationships. This invisible bureaucracy smoothed the way for later institutions. Hierarchy and authority were practiced long before kings claimed thrones. Roles, responsibilities, and expectations structured communities. People learned to obey, negotiate, and anticipate. Observation trained attention and memory. Children internalized patterns of behavior. Adulthood required repeating, refining, and managing those lessons. Religion and ritual reinforced social cohesion. Ceremonies marked seasons, success, and failure. Belief structured daily life, offering both comfort and control. Trade, specialization, and surplus management prepared economies. Skill, exchange, and division of labor became normalized. Society practiced complexity long before formal states appeared. Conflict resolution evolved subtly. Negotiation, hierarchy, and ritualized responses became standard. Violence was tempered by structure and expectation. Environmental adaptation strengthened resilience. Humans learned to manage crops, domesticate animals, and settle sustainably. Even failure was a teacher. Generational memory accumulated quietly. Mistakes, successes, and habits persisted in culture. Story, and behavior. Each generation carried forward lessons unspoken, but effective. Eccentricities and obsessions, once private, shaped group behavior, attention to detail, ritualized action, and subtle control propagated through community. Society learned to mimic what worked. Even fragility had a role. Observation of weakness informed survival strategies. Expectation tempered behavior and guided preparation. By the time writing, law, and empires appeared, humans had already rehearsed civilization. Foundations were invisible but solid. Order, habit, and hierarchy were practiced for generations before codification. And yet, all of this remained quiet. Progress wasn't sudden, dramatic, or easily noticed. It accumulated slowly, imperceptibly, like sediment forming rock over centuries. Next, we'll drift toward the first experiments with cities, governance, and formalized social structures. Because humans had practiced everything in principle, now they were ready to make it permanent. After thousands of years of practice, humans began to settle more permanently. Villages merged into towns, and towns slowly became the first proto-cities. Population density forced organization in ways mobility had never required. Living close together made cooperation unavoidable. Food storage, sanitation, and defense needed planning. Every person's role mattered more than before. Trade became more formalized. Surplus grain, crafted tools, and rare goods moved systematically. Paths and markets reflected patterns that had long existed in practice. Leadership started to codify. Individuals who had long guided communities through observation became recognized. Authorities, management turned into proto-governance. Specialization expanded. Builders, potters, merchants, and scribes appeared in larger numbers. Skill and labor were organized carefully, almost like rehearsal for later bureaucracy. Religion and ritual reinforced social cohesion. Temples became centers of power, learning, and record-keeping. Ceremonies marked both spiritual and civic life. Conflict resolution became more formal. Disputes were mediated by elders or officials. Rules began to extend beyond personal knowledge into collective expectation. Public spaces reflected authority. Plazas, walls, gates, and granaries organized both movement and hierarchy. Architecture became a silent teacher of order. Population pressure required new routines. Schedules, obligations, and roles grew more rigid. Mobility became limited, replaced by dependence on structured systems. Observation and memory were now shared. Written records began to supplement oral tradition. Counting, tracking, and accountability extended beyond individual minds. Children grew up under these structures. They learned hierarchy, ritual, and responsibility early. Expectation became natural, almost instinctive. Even minor failures carried social consequences. A poor harvest or mismanaged trade could ripple through the town. Systems of accountability were subtle but persistent. Eccentricity and obsession among leaders shaped city life. Personal habits influenced trade, labor, and ritual. Society mirrored the idiosyncrasies of those in charge. By this point, civilization was rehearsed in principle. The lessons of observation, habit, and hierarchy had matured. Humans were ready to make the leap into enduring urban life. Next, we'll drift into how early cities managed resources, people, and power simultaneously. Because coordination on this scale required both subtlety and constant attention, and it set the stage for history as we recognize it. Once cities emerged, managing them became a delicate exercise in balance. Food, water, and shelter had to be distributed reliably. A single misstep could create unrest quietly, without dramatic spectacle. Leaders relied on observation, records, and ritual to maintain stability. Surpluses were counted, stored, and sometimes rationed. Access to resources reinforced authority subtly. Labor was carefully organized. Farmers, builders, artisans, and servants operated according to structured schedules. Every task contributed to city stability, whether anyone acknowledged it or not. Trade networks expanded. Goods from neighboring settlements flowed in patterns shaped by both geography and habit. Market activity became predictable, reinforcing social order. Religious and civic rituals intertwined. Temples and ceremonies organized social life and justified authority. Faith supported administration almost as effectively as law. Education reflected city priorities. Counting, record-keeping, literacy, and protocol were emphasized. Children and young adults learned to manage expectations as much as skills. Surveillance and observation persisted. Advisors, scribes, and family monitored activity discreetly. Trust was carefully rationed and behavior subtly guided. Conflict resolution became formalized. Elders, officials, or ritualized mediation handled disputes. Violence became less spontaneous and more procedural. Infrastructure required constant attention. Walls, drainage, roads, and storage needed maintenance. Neglect could disrupt both daily life and authority quietly. Leaders' personal habits shaped city life. Daily routines, dietary preferences, and obsessions influenced labor schedules. Even minor eccentricities propagated widely. Health and sanitation were ongoing concerns. Disease spread more easily in dense settlements. Observation and preventive measures were essential, though limited. Social hierarchy became increasingly visible. Clothing, housing, and access to spaces reflected status clearly. Mobility within society depended largely on birth and compliance. Routines dominated life. Daily rhythm, ceremonial timing, and labor obligations structured existence. Even leisure was organized carefully, reflecting hierarchy. By mastering the subtle coordination of resources, people, and rituals, early cities stabilized. Patterns established here would echo in future empires. Order became habitual, persistent, and quietly powerful. Next, we'll drift into how leadership, succession, and dynastic obsession influenced the growth of these early urban centers. Because without controlled continuity, all this careful structure could unravel. With cities came concentrated authority. Leadership was no longer temporary or informal, it required continuity. Dynasties emerged to maintain stability. Often obsessively, succession became a central concern. Heirs had to be healthy, competent, and politically acceptable. Failure to plan quietly threatened the entire urban system. Marriages were carefully arranged. Alliances, property, and power dictated partnerships. Love and preference were secondary considerations. Children were trained early. Observation, ritual, education, and labor prepared them for responsibility. Every action carried subtle lessons about hierarchy. Parental oversight was constant. Behavior, health, and even mood were monitored. Mistakes were catalogued quietly for future reference. Rulers developed personal habits that shaped the city. Eccentricities, routines, and obsessions propagated outward. Society mirrored the idiosyncrasies of those in charge. Internal family dynamics were political. Sibling rivalry, favoritism, and alliances influenced succession. Even affection was strategic. Dynastic obsession sometimes led to inbreeding. Health, temperament, and physical traits were carefully preserved. Fragility and eccentricity multiplied over generations. Advisors and officials reinforced continuity. Record-keeping, ritual, and ceremony ensured predictable governance. Even minor disruptions were absorbed methodically. Power demanded patience. Decisions were deliberate, routines repetitive, and crises managed slowly. Immediacy was less important than persistence. Public rituals reinforced authority. Feasts, ceremonies, and appearances reminded citizens of hierarchy. Visual cues replaced constant explanation. Economic and labor structures were tied to succession. Heirs inherited not only wealth but expectation. Obligation flowed predictably, stabilizing society. Even minor personal preferences influenced city life. Food, dress, leisure, and work schedules all reflected elite habit. Leadership shaped culture quietly. As dynasties persisted, cities grew. Population density, trade, and infrastructure expanded. Patterns of power and expectation became deeply embedded. Next, we'll drift into the subtle tragedies of dynastic life, how privilege, observation, and inherited fragility quietly shaped suffering over generations. Because even in the absence of drama, these pressures had consequences. Even in the most controlled dynasties, life was quietly fragile. Privilege did not protect rulers or heirs from sickness, emotional strain, or inherited weakness. Observation and expectation amplified every small problem. Children carried burdens invisible to outsiders. Every misstep, cough, or tantrum was catalogued mentally. Failure had subtle but far-reaching consequences. Health concerns shaped daily routines. Illness could delay succession, alter alliances, or provoke anxiety. Even minor fevers were treated as political events. Emotional fragility compounded over generations. Melancholy, paranoia, and obsession often passed quietly from parent to child. Behavior was shaped as much by inheritance as by environment. Education was both privilege and pressure. Reading, counting, etiquette, and ritual required constant focus. Mistakes reflected poorly not just on the child, but the family. Children's play was never entirely free. Games reinforced hierarchy, obedience, or skill. Observation remained constant. Siblings competed subtly. Favoritism, expectation, and survival intertwined in everyday interactions. Rivalry became normalized, quietly shaping personality. Even adulthood offered limited relief. Routines, rituals, and obsession persisted. Leisure was structured, not spontaneous. Marriage added another layer of pressure. Political alliances, bloodline preservation, and succession required careful planning. Personal happiness was often secondary. Mental strain was invisible, but persistent. Anxiety, vigilance, and responsibility shaped daily decisions. Eccentricity or obsession often disguised deeper stress. Health and appearance remained under scrutiny. Physical weakness or deformity carried consequences. Even small signs of fragility were noted and remembered. Dynastic pressures created cycles of tension. Each generation repeated the lessons and errors of the previous one. Tradition became both protection and constraint. Privilege carried expectation. Observation and scrutiny were constant. Even those at the top rarely experienced freedom from pressure. And yet, life continued quietly. Routines, habits, and ritual carried people through. History often remembers achievement, but the personal weight persisted invisibly. Next, we'll drift into the final reflections on how humanity's long rehearsal of observation, habit, and hierarchy prepared civilization as we know it. Because all these quiet pressures, eccentricities, and routines eventually laid the groundwork for everything that followed. Across tens of thousands of years, humans practiced the art of living collectively. Observation, memory, and repeated routine quietly taught lessons that no single ruler or city could invent alone. Patterns of behavior became second nature, invisible but powerful. Hierarchy emerged gradually. Authority, roles, and responsibility were rehearsed long before formal kings claimed thrones. Even fragile dynasties reinforced the logic of organization. Habits shaped individuals and societies alike. Daily routines, rituals, and expectations became scaffolding for larger structures. Behavior reinforced stability without conscious instruction. Observation became a communal tool. Children watched elders, communities monitored neighbors, and leaders watched both. Knowledge passed quietly, without written law, shaping survival. Fragility, eccentricity, and obsession persisted. These traits influenced decision-making, ritual, and culture. Even small personal habits left enduring traces. Cities emerged as organized extensions of practiced behavior. Resource management, labor coordination, and ritualized authority became necessary. The invisible lessons of millennia made urban life possible. Trade, education, and craft evolved slowly. Skill, record-keeping, and specialization reflected inherited patterns of expectation. Complexity became natural. Conflict resolution matured subtly. Ritualized negotiation, hierarchy, and observation mitigated chaos. Violence was managed rather than constant. Even failure carried lessons. Illness, misjudgment, and short-lived rulers revealed limits and prompted adaptation. Fragility informed survival strategies. Dynastic obsession reinforced continuity. Succession, marriage, and inheritance became tools for stability. Patterns of expectation persisted across generations. By the time formal empires, law codes, and writing emerged, humans had rehearsed civilization extensively. The principles of order, hierarchy, and structured behavior were already embedded in daily life. Written law and monumental architecture were extensions of practices already in place. And yet, the process was quiet, almost imperceptible. Society advanced not in dramatic leaps, but in subtle, cumulative rehearsals. Habit, observation, and inherited expectation shaped history as much as ambition or conquest. So tonight, as we reflect on the hidden 100,000 years before formal civilization, we see human life as a slow, gentle, persistent rehearsal. Every step, every routine, every subtle observation prepared the world for cities, kings, and empires. Even without spectacle, human ingenuity was quietly at work. Endless repetition, careful observation, and social rehearsal created the foundations of everything that followed. And that, in its own patient, invisible way, is a story worth drifting off to sleep thinking about. Now, as we settle deeper into the quiet of the evening, let's drift slowly through the gentle rhythms of early human life. Imagine the soft glow of a fire, the murmurs of your companions, and the long, patient passage of days. Before cities, before kings, humans learned to notice. Every rustle in the grass, every shifting season, every subtle change in the sky mattered. Observation was survival, but it was also learning, quietly, patiently. Children watched adults, absorbing habits almost unconsciously. They learned to gather, to prepare, to negotiate. Curiosity was tucked carefully into play, observation, and imitation. Days were long and repetitive. Hunting, foraging, crafting, and resting followed subtle rhythms. Even moments of leisure taught endurance, skill, and awareness. Communities practiced cooperation naturally, sharing labor, distributing resources, and organizing shelter were rehearsed endlessly. Order emerged gently, without ceremony or decree. Small mistakes were lessons, not disasters, a misjudged hunt, a forgotten berry patch. A misplaced to law taught adaptation. The lessons were absorbed quietly over many generations. Ritual and pattern became comforting. Movement of the sun, phases of the moon, and seasonal cycles guided activity. Predictability soothed, structured, and prepared minds. Even fragility shaped behavior. Illness, injury, and emotional strain were observed carefully. Every weakness taught caution. Every failure informed adaptation. Eccentricities existed even then. Some individuals hoarded. Objects followed unusual routines or created small private habits. These personal quirks influenced communities subtly, like a gentle current in a river. As humans learned cooperation and hierarchy, subtle leadership emerged. Not kings, not empires yet, but quiet guidance who gathered first, who observed best, who remembered most. Influence spread without notice. Trade, exchange, and negotiation appeared naturally. Objects, skills, and knowledge moved along paths shaped by habit. Communities rehearsed complexity before they formalized it. And yet, life was calm, repetitive, and gently absorbing. Even challenges were small, measured, and navigable. Every day offered opportunity to notice, adapt, and survive. So as you drift further into sleep tonight, consider the quiet, patient rehearsal of humanity across tens of thousands of years. The routines, the observations, the habits, they are the invisible legacy we carry, even now. And with that, let your mind float gently through the soft, slow rhythm of human history. No drama, no rush, only the calm persistence of life preparing for civilization. Sleep now, and let the ancient lessons of patience, observation, and quiet endurance guide your dreams.
Today we will talk about a very old history topic. This story is from a time when there were no house, no cities, no schools and no books. This is the story of fire. Fire is not just a thing but that burns. Fire changed everything. Fire made human different from animals. Without fire there would be no food like today, no protection, no progress, and maybe no modern world. This is the story of how fire slowly changed human life step by step. Long, long ago, humans were very weak. They had no clothes, no proper homes, and no weapons. They lived in forest and open land. They were always afraid. Big animals hunted them, cold weather hot there, dark nights scared them. Human ate raw food. Raw meat was hard to chew. Raw plants were bitter and dangerous. People got sick easily. Many people died young. Life was very hard. The first time humans saw fire. Yes, fire was not first made by human. Fire came from nature. Lighting heat trees, volcanoes burned land, dry forest caught fire. Early humans saw fire from far away. They saw bright light. They felt heat. At first, they were scared. Fire was dangerous. Fire burned skin. Fire destroyed trees. But humans are curious. They watched fire carefully. Slowly, humans understood something important. Fire is dangerous, but fire is also useful. Fire give heat, fire give light. People start keeping fire interested of running away. They carried burning wood from natural fire. They portrayed that fire carefully. If fire dead, life became hard again. Fire became like a friend. Fire and warmth. Cold weather was deadly before fire. Winter killed many people. People shivered at night. Fire changed this. Fire kept human warm and people could live in a colder place. They could travel to new lands. Fire helped humans survive winter. This was a very big change in history. Fire and light. Before fire, night was very dark. Darkness brought fear. Wild animal hunted at night. Fire brought light. People could see at night. They could stay together. They could talk and think. This helped humans before social. This helped humans share idea. Fire created community. Fire and protection. Fire scared wild animal we are afraid of flame. They stayed away from fire. Humans used fire as protection. They slept near fire. This saved many lives. Fire became a side. Fire and cooked food. This was one of the biggest change in human history. Yes, human learned to cook food. Cooked meat was soft. Cooked plant were safe. People became stronger. Their brains grew bigger. Good food gave more energy. Scientists believe cooking helped human become intelligent. Fire helped create the human brain. Fire and tools. Fire helped humans make tools. They hardened wood in fire. They shaped stone using heat. Later, fire helped me melt metal. This lead to copper tools. They bronze tools. They iron tools. Fire started technology. Fire and caves. Human lived in caves. Caves were dark and cold. Fire made caves livable. Fire kept animal away. Fire gave light inside cave. Human painted on cave walls using firelight. This was early art. This was early culture. Fire and social life. Fire brought people together. People sat around fire. They talked. They shared stories. This was the beginning of language. This was the beginning of tradition. Fire created human society. Learned to make fire. At first, human protected natural fire. Later, they learned to make fire. They rubbed stones. They rubbed wood. This was a huge discovery. Now fire was always available. Human we are no longer dependent on nature. This was the freedom. Fire and migration. Fire allowed humans to move. They went to good lands. They crossed mountains. Fire helped humans spread across the world, from Africa to Asia, from Asia to Europe, from Europe to everywhere. Fire helped humans conquering that plant. Fire and religion. Fire became scared. People believe fire was a magic. People worshipped fire. Yes, many religions used fire. Fire rituals started. Fire became a symbol of life. Fire and farming. Fire helped clear forest. People burned land. This made farming possible. Yes, farming changed human life. People settled down. Villages formed and cities we are born. Are you know? Fast start civilization. Fire and industry. Thousands of years later, fire powered machine. Fire boiled water, steam and gas were born, factors started, trains moved, fire became energy, fire and modern world. Today, fire still help us. Electric comes from fire. Cooking or users use fire. Industries uses fire, and fire still saves human life. Conclusion: fire is not just that the fire is the history. Fire made humans human. Without fire, there would be no civilization, no cities, no technology. Fast is the greatest discovery in human history. This, thank you. Today, now this is a very interesting story. I am feeling mm, very relaxed now because I am try to very best now to please subscribe, like, and comment. Thank you. Today we will talk about a very old history topic. This story is from a time when there were no house, no cities, no schools, and no books. This is the story of fire. Fire is not just a thing but that burns. Fire changed everything. Fire made human different from animals. Without fire, there would be no food like today, no protection, no progress, and maybe no modern world. This is the story of how fire slowly changed human life step by step. Long ago, humans were very weak. They had no clothes, no proper homes, and no weapons. They lived in forest and open land. They were always afraid. Big animals hunted them, cold weather hot there, dark nights scared them. Human ate raw food. Raw meat was hard to chew. Raw plants were bitter and dangerous. People got sick easily. Many people died young. Life was very hard. The first time humans saw fire. Yes, fire was not first made by human. Fire came from nature. Lighting heat trees, volcanoes burned land, dry forest caught fire. Early humans saw fire from far away. They saw bright light. They felt heat. At first, they were scared. Fire was dangerous. Fire burned skin. Fire destroyed trees. But humans are curious. They watched fire carefully. Slowly, humans understood something important. Fire is dangerous, but fire is also useful. Fire give heat, fire give light. People start keeping fire interested of running away. They carried burning wood from natural fire. They portrayed that fire carefully. If fire dead, life became hard again. Fire became like a friend. Fire and warmth. Cold weather was deadly before fire. Winter killed many people. People shivered at night. Fire changed this. Fire kept human warmth and people could live in a colder place. They could travel to new lands. Fire helped humans survive winter. This was a very big change in history. Fire and light. Before fire, night was very dark. Darkness brought fear. Wild animal hunted at night. Fire brought light. People could see at night. They could stay together. They could talk and think. This helped humans before social. This helped humans share idea. Fire created community. Fire and protection. Fire scared wild animal we are afraid of flame. They stayed away from fire. Humans used fire as protection. They slept near fire. This saved many lives. Fire became a side. Fire and cooked food. This was one of the biggest change in human history. Yes, human learned to cook food. Cooked meat was soft. Cooked plant were safe. People became stronger. Their brains grew bigger. Good food gave more energy. Scientists believe cooking helped human become intelligent. Fire helped create the human brain. Fire and tools. Fire helped humans make tools. They hardened wood in fire. They shaped stone using heat. Later, fire helped me melt metal. This lead to copper tools. They bronze tools. They iron tools. Fire started technology. Fire and caves. Human lived in caves. Caves were dark and cold. Fire made caves livable. Fire kept animal away. Fire gave light inside cave. Human painted on cave walls using firelight. This was early art. This was early culture. Fire and social life. Fire brought people together. People sat around fire. They talked. They shared stories. This was the beginning of language. This was the beginning of tradition. Fire created human society. Learn to make fire. At first, human protected natural fire. Later, they learned to make fire. They rubbed stones. They rubbed wood. This was a huge discovery. Now fire was always available. Human we are no longer dependent on nature. This was the freedom. Fire and migration. Fire allowed humans to move. They went to good lands. They crossed mountains. Fire helped humans spread across the world, from Africa to Asia, from Asia to Europe, from Europe to everywhere. Fire helped humans conquering that plant. Fire and religion. Religion. Fire became scared. People believe fire was a magic. People worshipped fire. Yes, many religions used fire. Fire rituals started. Fire became a symbol of life. Fire and farming. Fire helped clear forest. People burned land. This made farming possible. Yes, farming changed human life. People settled down. Villages formed and cities we are born. Are you know? Fast start civilization. Fire and industry. Thousands of years later, fire powered machine, fire boiled water, steam and gas were born. Factors started, trains moved, fire became energy. fire and modern world. Today fire still help us. Electric comes from fire. Cooking or users use fire. Industries uses fire, and fire still saves human life. Conclusion: fire is not just that the fire is the history. Fire made humans human. Without fire there would be no civilization, no cities, no technology. Fast is the greatest discovery in a human history. This Thank you today. Now this is a very interesting story. I am feeling mm, very relaxed now, because I am try to very best now to please subscribe, like, and comment. Thank you.